First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and Alternative to Violence to participate in this important conference and having the ability to share some of our work and experience. It is the organization I'm representing and also leading in terms of being the executive director is called Alternative to Violence. In everyday language in Norwegian, that is Alternativ til vold, and the abbreviation is ATV. Today I will try to share the work we are doing in terms of our practice, what we are gaining, and sharing our theoretical fundament and the knowledge coming out of this. And we have been, as this says, we have been around since 1987. Maybe the overall experience we have done is that domestic violence and trying to understand the persons who are perpetrating violence, abusing others, that is a complex issue. This is not a one-dimensional problem with easy solutions. But a little bit about the organization and who I'm representing and myself. Today, Alternative to Violence is a therapy and documentation center on domestic violence. And we are working both with adult offenders, adolescents, both adolescents that has developed a problem with violence and aggression, but also adolescents being a part of the group we call children that are exposed or affected by domestic violence. But also adult victims and children that are exposed to domestic violence. Alternative to Violence is an NGO, but we are an important part, we are a central part in the Norwegian government's strategy and action plans in order to combat domestic violence as a problem in the Norwegian society. By today we have 15 clinics all over Norway. Norway is a huge country in terms of kilometers. We are 5 million people, and so in that respect a fairly small country. The statistics from our last annual report from 2020 says that we had 1,890 men, women and children in therapy through that year. I will today also refer a little bit to the research that is done on this field, especially the research that we have been doing on our own practice. And I will try to especially introduce and present and describe to you the basic principles on how we work with the adults that perpetrates violence. As you know, on a societal level, on a group level, violence in intimate relationships is mainly a men's problem. It's a masculine problem. But on the individual level, that doesn't mean that all the persons who are perpetrating violence are men and all the adult persons exposed to violence are women. On the individual level, there's also women with problems with aggression and violence, and men who are exposed. But that is not to confuse with what is the main problem. This is a male problem, first of all. Especially when it comes to the serious violence, which is the most important one as well. I also like to try to describe the work of our ATV to be based on different sources, different references. One of them is the understanding of gender, power, and culture in society. The next one is the stories of battered women, battering men, and children being exposed to family violence. In other words, we don't do only research work and theoretical work. We think one of the, maybe the most important source is actually to meet the people who are affected by violence, both the persons perpetrating violence and the persons who are exposed to violence. And also our work is based on professional clinical psychology and research. Being an NGO, we are a specialized service in the sense that we are not going to be a service or an outpatient clinic for people with mental distress in general. Our specific task is to work on the issue of domestic violence and do the best we can in order to make it stop. That's our very specific assignment. That's what our funding is about. As I said, to begin with, we have definitely realized that violence is a complex issue, and domestic violence is a complex issue. I will, as I said, give you the basics and the basic principles of how we work with the adults who perpetrate violence, but also important examples of that can illustrate some of the complexity is the fact that we also need to have first-hand knowledge about the consequences of violence when we are working with the persons who are perpetrating violence. It's not enough to only focus on the violence itself and the person's thinking and behavior and things like that. We really need to know the detailed implications of violence when we are working with the perpetrators. We also need to understand and include a trauma perspective in this. Not in the sense that arguing or having an idea that the perpetrators of violence, the person perpetrating violence are traumatized, thereby they are not responsible for their violent behavior. Not in that sense. But I'll give you an important example, because as the research also says, the majority of our clients, and in many clinical settings, is the fact that the majority of adults who perpetrate violence has experienced domestic violence at home as children. And the first, when we started to highlight the importance and the need to work with the perpetrating person in order to stop the violence, a central point in the first analysis that was provided by the women's movement in the 70s and the 80s was that the violence men use is a product and a result of the patriarchal socialization of boys into men. in the sense that their abusive fathers becomes their role models. And of course, that in itself, there's nothing wrong about that. But it's definitely not sufficient. It's not sufficient to think that men's violence is only about patriarchal attitudes. It's definitely about that as well. It's about culture, as Annika was talking about. I'll come back to that. But that analysis overlooks the fact that for these children, if we try to make them an example, they are not just exposed to abusive role models, but they are children, so they are also traumatized by the violence. They don't have the power to stop it. They don't have the power to change their parents, getting new parents. They are in an extremely powerless position, being exposed to something we know is harmful to their psychological development. That's why it's also important to include a trauma perspective into this. And as Annika was talking about with her reference to Christianity, culture is extremely important. Not in the sense that one culture is violent and another culture isn't. If we are going down that path, we need to ask the question, to what degree and what is the level of patriarchal values in any given culture? That is a totally different question. And I think also, although it's not my special field of competence, tradition and culture is hard to change because it's so embedded in our identities, and it's constituting an important part of what is constituting our identities. But I had a very fulfilling experience working together with our sister organization in South Africa. In that context, I had the opportunity to work with a group of young men in the what is the word? The rural areas or the poor areas, outskirts of Cape Town. And I asked my colleague, Leslie Ann, who is the director of this organization, help me to find an approach to work with these men without being a white guy coming with my imperialistic ideas. And she gave me two important inputs. Find out if you are genuinely curious about their lives. And feel free to ask or invite them to discuss what parts of our traditions is valuable and that we should continue and develop, and what parts of our traditions and culture is harmful to us that we should leave behind. I think that was extremely good questions in order to feel able to approach such a difficult thing, an issue as culture and tradition. This field has also been influenced by the latest brain research that has come up for the last 10, 15 years, how the brain of children are are affected by trauma. This field has also been increasingly interested in the fact that most perpetrating men that I see and my organizations meet are parents. They have children. So they are either abusers or abused in addition to being a parent. So there has also been an necessary focus on how to integrate a parenting perspective and a child perspective into the work on trying to stop the violence. And lastly, on this example list is also an issue that is with focus on ourselves as helpers, as professionals. And it has embedded in it the question, what does it do to us to work with abusers and abused victims of domestic violence as our professional life and over time? That has become increasingly important in order to take care of ourselves, to take care of our colleagues, and to take care of our services. It's also a very strong experience and an important message in our work and in our knowledge that we, to put it a bit bluntly, I think when we try to attack and combat domestic violence as a problem in society, we need to go beyond defining this as a social problem. It is a social problem. It is even a threat to democracy. It's a violation of human rights. It's definitely constituting a gender equality problem. And it's also a criminal justice problem in the sense that if we find this unacceptable to our societies, we need law and enforcement that can work towards less violence in society. But with all the knowledge that has been developed, also in terms of what violence is for the perpetrating person, we need also to think of this as a health problem. We need to equally to identifying it as a social problem, we need to identify it as a public health problem. And one of the largest research projects in this field for the last 10-15 years, the Adverse Childhood Experience study by Vincent Felitti, I will come back to that, is really arguing for that. That means that we need to look into the legislation, and with a short reference to the minister that was very inspiring to listen to, I think there is also good arguments that we need a specific legislation. This is not my field of competence. I'm a specialist in clinical psychology, but I've been working in this field for 32 years. There's so many challenges and problems, also due to the simple fact that there is often there is no witnesses to this. In the United States, they have specific domestic violence courts. Maybe it would be a good thing to have a specific domestic violence legislation and domestic violence courts. That would also highlight the status of this difficult issue. And it would, I think it would have many positive effects. But I will leave it at that. And we are still struggling to find the golden standard of how to work with perpetrating men. We are on our way, we have good results, we have promising results, but there's still a lot of questions that is unanswered. So we still need to ask the questions, what are the causes of domestic violence? Because what we think about the causes and the drivers of domestic violence should have implications for what we are actually doing. In physical medicine, that is a simple, obvious example. Before you start a surgery, you need to identify the problem so you can apply the proper surgery. This field of work we are in is not that specific and exact. But still, with a reference to medical terminology, are the medicine we describe, that means our interventions, are they reflecting our knowledge about what the violence is about? We need to keep that question active. We need to be guided by these questions. I will be very brief, just referring to some of the research in this field, because I need to make sufficient time to share the principles of how we work with our male and female clients who perpetrate violence. In terms of trying to find different types of violent offenders, the research is scarce. Low risk, moderate risk, and high risk batterer is the most consistent research so far. Modest to moderate to low effect sizes in the outcome research in general so far. I mentioned Vincent Felietti's important study. Adverse childhood experiences is referring to mentally and physically stressful experiences for children, potentially traumatizing. And one of the findings in this big study is that being exposed to violence as a child is an underreported source, of course, to understand the development of physical problems, social problems, and psychological problems. This is not just by reproducing violence from one family to the other. This is a much wider dimension. It says that people with ordinary symptoms and troubles may have the experience of being exposed to violence as a child as one of the background factors. I recommend you to go into the ACEstudy.org site and read more about this. This implies, of course, that we should also increase our efforts to work with children and also working preventive with families, and of course, most of all, doing whatever we can to help people stop using violence. I will I have to switch a bit of the research. Some examples from the PhD studies that has been done on our work. As I said, male offender clients, 70% exposed to domestic violence in childhood. That's not a coincidence, it sounds like. And clients exposed to violence in childhood use more violence than clients that don't have any history of being exposed to violence in childhood. 71% of the men fulfilled the diagnostic criteria for at least one ongoing psychiatric disorder, which raises the question, is this psychiatric disorder the reason for why they have been developing problem with violence, or is having a problem with violence one of the background factors for developing a psychiatric disorder? It's important that we don't jump to conclusions when we get these findings. A fairly low dropout rate in our work, 4% within the first 3 sessions. This is the latest research study that is published this summer, which is the indicators of an evaluation on the outcome of the treatment. And some of the conclusions is that the percentage of use of all types of violence decreased from pre-treatment to follow-up. That means 1.5 years after ending treatment, according to both the men and their partners, although not fully confirmed by their partners. Number of sessions was associated with low risk of having used physical and physically controlling violence 1.5 years after treatment. This, we make a distinction between physical violence in terms of hitting and those classical forms, and physically controlling violence, that is to use your body to intimidate, to, if you were my partner, I push you up. I don't hit you, but I push you up to the wall. I can take a thing like this. All the ways you use your physical force to intimidate or stepping over the autonomy boundaries. And also men's clinical distress that was measured declined over the course of therapy. And that is, of course, a good thing, although alcohol, drug dependency, and psychiatric diagnosis were not associated with levels or change in use of violence. What that means is interesting. We need to explore that and find out that. It's a good thing and an important thing that also the level of mental distress is changing positively. Also because our experience is that the men who are and women who are using violence that comes to us, they are distressed, both by the violence, but also usually by many other things in their lives. I have to go back to the research if I have the time. I will focus now on giving you the basics and the basic principles of how we approach and how we work with our perpetrating adults who perpetrates violence. The crucial decision 32 years ago when we started Alternative to Violence, we were 3 fairly young men that came out from the university having been studying psychology, being psychologists. And we tried, and we had the discussion, what kind of model, what kind of framework should we use, should our services be presented as? Should we be a psychoanalytically oriented treatment? Should we be cognitive behavioral in our methodology? Should we offer family therapy? And this decision was that none of these established schools of treatment and therapy was specifically dealing with the issue of domestic violence. So we didn't know if there were good models to use when it came to domestic violence. So we decided, firstly, not to decide for a model. We decided, let's meet the men first, and let's relate to the few books that was written about how they are presenting their violence, that it's usually is with a tendency to minimize what has been happening, to externalize, blaming the partner for being the reason why the violence happened. After starting to meet our clients, we started slowly to design a kind of our own model. We were influenced and by all the different schools of treatment and therapy, but we thought, let's try to make a model that is highlighting the violence most of all. That should be the main focus, that should be the red thread through our work, and let's explore and expand our way of working and to develop a model that is inclusive but still violence specific and focused. We learned that we need to be aware of the fact that violence can come in all forms, not just physical violence and psychological, emotional violence. That was maybe what the minister was referring to as mental violence. Material violence, sexualized violence, economic violence. Latent violence, we think, is also very important. Latent violence meaning how it affects the victims of the violence, the fact that the violence has been there. It has been a reality. Why should I be certain that it won't come again? So the effects of the violence can be for a very long time. The effects of physical violence can be there for a very long time and having a controlling function. It's controlling in its consequences. One of my female clients that was exposed to violence illustrated this by saying, Marius, I'm so tired of weighing my thoughts, weighing my words, weighing my behavior, constantly thinking about how can I avoid behaving and doing that could lead to more violence. Of course, in these days we also need to include digital violence, with mobile phones to be quite a controlling instrument for those who do that. In our work, we have been preoccupied with and interested in not just the causes of violence, because you can think it's a way to see it that the causes helps us to understand what sets the violence off. Not just that, but as a main principle. But we have been very interested in what is maintaining the violence. When it's there as a problem, what makes it go on? And one important issue that is important and easy to target in consultation, in therapeutic consultation, is the way the standard client is presenting their violence. By justifying it, by externalizing it, by denying it, by minimizing it, and also by thinking of this in terms of fragmentation. Fragmentation meaning not necessarily deny that it was going on right there and then and it was serious, but it didn't have any consequences before or after. But when we talk to the children and the adult victims, they say that it flavors our lives. It's there, the consequences and the presence and the existence is there all the time. So we thought if we could challenge the justifications and externalizations and these ways of presenting and thinking around the violence, if we can challenge that, we would challenge one important maintaining factor. It's a big difference between saying she deserves it, or talking about the violence in quarreling terms and talking about it vaguely. From there to saying that this is my problem, this is my behavior, I am the one who actually uses violence, I am the one who can do something about it, it's my responsibility to do something about it. That's two very different ways of thinking about your problem with violence, isn't it? We also look into the emotional side of this, in the sense that it's not just focusing on behavior, that means the violent behavior and the way they think around their behavior, violence and themselves, but also how they are dealing with emotions in this. And of course, shame is an extremely important emotion in this. Our experience is that said in principle and in general, the shame is always there. Either it's apparent and up in the daylight, or we have to work for a while to get in contact with it. And of course, the shame has the human ability and tendency that we don't want to talk about what is shameful. Or what? And the shame, our understanding is that the shame is increasing the risk for him not to want to talk about it, not to want to think about it. Make it go away by not talk about it and think about it. And we do, in therapy, we do the other way around. We talk about the violence, we invite him to talk about the violence, which activates the shame, but that's the way forward, isn't it? Then we can explore the connections between the violence and the shame, and that the solution is not to think about it, but actually to confront it and find other ways and respectful ways of being in the relationship. This is the crude, basic principles of how we work. It's also embedded in an attitude, in the sense that if our dear friend, the journalist, the conferencier for the case was my client, I would fairly quick, when we met, I would ask you, I had just a little bit of information that it was an incident and episode happening 2 weeks ago. After the small talk, after being respectful and decent, I would kindly invite you to go back to that. I would identify the day, I would identify the place, and the way I do it is targeted, but it's in our work very respectful, very empathic, because it's not our job to harass people or being angry at people. We are professionals. And our clients also say that as a, if I can put it, as a common voice. Our clients said that it was extremely important that you took my violence seriously. And it was also totally necessary that I felt treated with respect. And it's not a contradiction. Not at all. Everybody needs to be treated with respect, especially if you are going to talk about difficult things. So this is a kind of there's 4 important issues we need to address, we think. We need to get the violence on the table, so to speak, by constructing it, by deconstructing it, by going into what really happened. It's difficult to change something that isn't there. We may have to make it be there through our conversation. And this is not necessarily easy for you, but I help you along the way, and I be sensitive. And through this mapping also of the key violent episodes, checking, finding and mapping for how long has this going on, how frequently has it been, what kind of violence, then we also get an assessment of the seriousness of this problem. And that can be very different from person to person. People also are different persons. They change in different tempo. So also characterizing our work is that we don't have a fixed set of time that you will have 14 sessions. Some come to us for 4 months, some is in treatment for 2.5, 3 years, if necessary. And we work on how this mapping is when you would like, what's your first name?
Rasmus.
When Rasmus would like to talk about and make me understand how difficult his partner is and why that started, I am dragging the focus back to you. What were your actions in this? That doesn't mean that you are the only one in the room, but it's your way of behaving, your thinking. That's what I need to know in the first place. And by this mapping and by talking about the violence in concrete ways, that strengthens the feeling that, and Rasmus' sense of that I am actually doing something active in this. I'm not just reacting passively to what everybody around me is doing to me. In those steps, we move into the position where Rasmus says that this is my problem. This is my way of reacting. This is my responsibility to do something about. That's the first step. Combining, acknowledging the violence and working on the violence being my problem. When that is established well in our work, then I start to become curious about what can help us understand why you developed the problem with violence, why you became so depending on violence. And of course, one of the classic examples is that Rasmus is one of the 70% that was exposed to violence in his own home. That is significant life experience that we need to include in the work. Also, if he don't want to be repeating his father's tendencies onto his own children. The intergenerational cycle of violence. And of course, in our work, we also have partner contact, and we have also an through-going focus on the consequences of the violence and the implications of violence, of course, to his children, to his partner, but also to himself. How are you affected by your violence? What has that done to your life, your self-image, what you think about yourself as a person, as a man, as a father, etc.? We have been writing about these things, so this has to be only some headlines and highlights. This is just some examples of what may be the driving force or the causes behind violence. For some men, it's about maintaining a sense of masculinity. For some men, it's about holding on to your partner by force, underlying, if I have really problems with my self-image, self-worth, if I don't think I'm worth anything, how the hell should somebody love me? So if I want a partner and have a family like everybody else, this may not be a very explicit thought, but it may be the psychological driver, if you understand what I mean. Or violence can also have the function of creating distance. If you have trouble with intimacy and feeling comfortable with intimacy, a lot of my clients has that, then the violence can also be a way of creating an emotional distance. And that is a kind of what we could call an avoidance practice, in the sense that making a conflict, a quarrel, a threatening situation to avoid having focus and having an intense feeling of not being able to deal with intimacy. These things are we exploring in, and we think it's important to explore it as a part of the treatment work we are doing. What we have been probably working mostly with, in addition to also making our treatment model and practice culturally sensitive. That's a big department. I won't be able to get into that now today. But these issues concerning parenting and fatherhood, we have been working on integrating these important issues and what is important in their everyday life into the treatment. As I wrote a chapter in the book in 2006 about this, and recommended then that we need to work with the men's images of themselves as fathers. Men as women has different ideas about being fathers and mothers. How the violence is affecting the child-father relationship, how the violence is affecting the child-mother relationship, how the child is affected by the violence, both on a short-term and a long-term basis. We need to explore life learnings from their own fathers about being fathers. And as a part of this, also with an explicit reference to a child perspective, we need to educate the men on the basic needs of children with a developmental perspective, and how the presence of violence is obstructing the coverage of these needs. This is a small therapeutic tool that we use in the groups when we work with, also individually for that sake, when we work on fatherhood and parenting. We ask them to bring a picture of their child or their children for the next meeting, and then they are going to present their children. And that is a mix of a very nice thing to do for them and a very heavy thing to do for them. Some of them don't know their children very well, and of course it's extremely painful to actually explicitly start to talk about the effects of the violence onto their children. Present your child. Who is she, he? Tell us about his or her personality. What is the child's dreams and needs? What does he, she like? How is he, she affected by the violence? What is your feelings towards him or her? This could be a picture. That's not a child of one of my clients. That's my child, Sarah. And I could, of course, stay here and talk about her for hours with a big warm heart about her fantastic abilities, how inspiring she is to me as being my daughter, her vulnerabilities, what she likes. She likes small social settings, not big settings. She likes writing. She likes singing. For a while, she was in a club doing bow and arrow. And I think she's very intelligent. She's reflecting on life as an adult 18-year-old. It would be so hard for me if violence should be a part of this reality. And I should really start talking about how she is affected, graphically here with her face and everything. It's a powerful exercise. I have to be a bit true to the time. I know I'm a few minutes over. I think our work is illustrating that it's possible to combine a focus on responsibility, accountability, and masculinity issues with also focus on trauma, neglect, the fact that many have experienced violence in the child as a child, working on how the violence have potentially made injuries to development of attachment, and possibly injured the development of emotion regulation, which is psychologically extremely important in this. I would like to finish off with politics. One of the really engaged politicians in Norway was the former Minister of Justice, Knut Storberget. He was personally extremely preoccupied with that we had to do something about this. And he said, he was also a member of the UN network of male leaders, and he said, the single most important thing we can do to improve the childhood conditions of our children is to make domestic violence one of our top priorities as leaders. Strong words. Thank you.
Thank you, Marius, for this very interesting and fresh approach. We have questions.
Okay.
Yeah, this is for you.
Thank you.
So let's start from the most popular. And how does the perpetrators agree with the therapy? Are they sent there by someone or they participate voluntarily?
Yes and yes. Half of our clients take contact themselves. Some few comes with a court order, and most of the other half is referred by the doctor, by the social services, by the police, all professionals that comes in contact with this family one way or the other.
And among those, how many there are those success stories?
We have presented that the violence is statistically significant reduced. And this is, we don't look at, in the research, we don't look at single persons, we look at the whole group of 84 as was enrolled in this study. And we see that it's a dramatic change in less violence. That means some are not changing, but some are totally free of violence, because you get the group average in the numbers and the data that comes out from this study. Okay. But the main results is that there is a very positive change.
That's very good. How many of your clients do the work once separated from their families? Is it better for them to be alone for this work, or is it better to have family support if they are willing?
That's a difficult question. For some, it would create some working peace if he was away from the family. But in real life, what we see is that men come to us when their partners have left them, for example. But it's of course also a very big difference between being left by the family or leaving the family for a while. I can ask, as a security question, I can ask my clients, how safe is it for your family to be together with you right now? Not implying that they should split up or anything, because that's not my work, that's not my job. Mm-hmm. And some men say, I don't know, and then I said, maybe you should ask your wife about that. And some men say, maybe it's not very safe for my family to be together with me now. Mm-hmm. And then I can ask him, what are you going to do about that? Mm-hmm. And some men move to a friend and stay there for a while. Mm-hmm. So this is, it's an important question, but it's impossible to say yes or no to that.
Okay, and last one, there are actually more questions. I hope you find time to answer to them in this special webpage.
Yeah.
But last one from here. If the perpetrator has been diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder, are you still able to treat him? If yes, how do they react to the therapy?
That is a difficult question because it's we could discuss if being psychopathic is a good term. I can agree that some of my clients are acting psychopathically. But being a psychopath is a diagnosis which is not valid anymore. In the professional community, there's also a lot of focusing on that psychopaths are traumatized children. Some of them I have been working well with, some of them I didn't work well with.
Okay, thank you very much, Marius.
Thank you.